but by the time I get done talking, your guys might hurt a little more. I got 2 apologies before I get going. I have way too many slides because I never met a slide I didn't like. I actually made them all. So it's like choosing amongst your children. And to make up for it, I'm going to talk really, really fast. So if you do have questions, we'll save those to the end and we'll dive into them. The first thing is we're going to talk about globalization, that in China today, Bill Gates is Britney Spears. In America today, Britney Spears is Britney Spears. That's the problem. Thomas Friedman, the author of The World is Flat. And then Bill Gates, in response, said we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Don't let yourself be lulled into inaction. So there's a lot of people out there that say, oh, the markets are terrible, we can't invest, the tips on personal portfolio. It's just that the things we're going to do are going to be very different than what we have done. And we'll get to that towards the end. The idea is, there was a show when I was growing up on TV called Rocky and Bullwinkle. And there was something called, and now it's time for something completely different. So what you're going to hear here in a little bit is really very different. So the flattening has begun. If you put your money in the US stock market 10 years ago, you now have about 50 cents on the dollar. That kind of stinks. And if your plan is to be spending over the course of the years, it's really bad. And if you look at Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRICS, as they're called, you've made anywhere from 100% on your money up to 200% on your money over the same period. And even with the big dramatic fall, they've fallen to a point much higher than the US markets. There's the collateral impact of that is that real assets, things like gold and oil and gas, have done much, much better than other investments. So the idea that we should have all of our money in US stocks just doesn't make any sense. It hasn't made sense for a decade. Actually, you can go back almost 13 years now, and it hasn't made sense. Yet most of us still have the bulk of our wealth in US stocks. And I always ask the question, why? In fact, how many times in the last 30 years has the US market been the best performing market? The answer is 0. How about the next 30 years? Probably 0. In fact, just because we live in the United States, why do we have the bulk of our wealth in US stocks? What if we moved to Japan? Would suddenly have Japanese stocks? What if we moved to Austria? Would you have Austrian stocks? What if we moved to Iceland? Most of you in this room could buy the entire Icelandic stock market, down 99%. So why is it that we have all our money in the US? Well, we're in a crisis. Everyone knows we're in a crisis. Everybody's talking about the crisis. In fact, there's been more mentions of the word depression in the last year than at any time in history. Everybody's talking about the Great Depression Part 2. The problem is, we're nowhere close to a depression. We're not even in a recession as bad as 82, 83. In fact, the other day I was watching a little blip of the Today Show, and they were showing people how to make soap in their bathtub. It's not that bad, and it's not going to get that bad. Okay? Yeah, we may have a repression, okay, worse than a recession, but not as bad as a depression. But we're not in a depression. We are in a crisis. But what is crisis? If you spell it out in Chinese, it's 2 symbols, wei, ji, danger plus opportunity. So yeah, there's lots of bad things going on, but there's also some of the greatest opportunities that we will ever see in our lifetime. For nimble businesses that you guys work in, from a whole host of investment ideas that we work in, there are the best opportunities that I have ever seen in my 25-year career, but you can't look in the normal places. You've got to think differently. Crisis is a turning point, meaning it will end. King Solomon asked his minions once, get me a sentence that will for always and everywhere be true. This too shall pass. Okay? Every crisis, there have been 124 banking crises in the last 100 years. They've all gone away. This one will too. But every little thing counts. Everything that you do, every move that you make really matters in a crisis. Now, back in 55 BC, Cicero says the budget must be balanced, the public debt must be reduced, the arrogancy of authorities must be moderated and controlled, payments to foreign governments must be reduced, if the nation doesn't go bankrupt, people must again learn to work instead of living on public assistance. Now, we could say that right now, and that was in 55 BC. Now, the crisis is huge, about $2 trillion and growing. The IMF, said it was about $1.4 trillion, and it's been growing. It's up about $2 trillion today. The problem is, people said, well, it's not as bad as the U.S. savings and loan crisis. Well, maybe it's a little bigger than that. Well, it's not as bad as the Japanese banking crisis. Well, maybe it's a little bit bigger than that now. And it's not as bad as the Asian banking crisis. But the Asian banking crisis was small. It was a little flea on the dog. We're the dog. And if the dog catches a problem, which is a $2 trillion crisis, it can be really ugly. And people think the crisis is over. And you keep talking about people saying, you know, I think Bernanke yesterday, part of the rally was that he said, we'll have a recovery by the end of this year. No chance. There's absolutely no chance we have a recovery when you look at, we're only about 25% of the way through the write-offs. Think about the banks. The banks as an industry only make $250 billion. They have to write off at least another $1.5 trillion. That means for 6 years, they're not going to make any money. How much would you pay for a stock that wasn't going to make money for the next 6 years? About $1.25, kind of where those stocks trade. Now the subprime crisis, that's a little bit out of the way. The AAA meltdown, that melted down. The asset-backed commercial paper shut down. The problem is the SIVs, the special investment vehicles. We're the only country in the world that hasn't adopted international GAAP accounting. Because if we adopted international GAAP accounting, two things would have to happen. One, companies would have to bring their off-balance sheet stuff on balance sheet. The second thing is the government would actually have to account for their future liabilities. In fact, what do people say that the budget deficit is in the United States this year? They say it's going to be about $1.4 trillion, something like that? No, closer to $5 trillion. Because that's cash accounting, the $1.4 trillion. If you include the future obligations, the current portion of the future obligations for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and prescription drugs, it's $5 trillion.